A la Derrida's critique of the metaphysics of presence, we should be wary of any supposedly unmediated appearance of something as present. This wariness is applied even by Derrida to Heidegger, who he rightly criticizes for still being implicitly bound to, quote, an entire metaphysics of proximity, of simple and immediate presence, a metaphorics associating the proximity of being with the values of neighboring, shelter, house, service, guard, voice, and listening. I single out here voice because it brings to mind the idea of the text speaking to us, of hearkening to the call of the text, of listening to what the text speaks, of what it really says. This approach is allied with the very phonocentrism Derrida critiques of grammatology, as relying on the metaphysical assumption of the voice's authenticity as harbinger of presence, securely deriving its authority from the breath of life instilled in the vocal human subject by God. We should, therefore, be wary of the text's voice. Texts do not speak. We speak texts into being with our voice. Texts do not precede the act of readerly choice that makes the ambiguous, unruly mass of signifiers into something sensible. Sense, that supposedly imbued in the text and located in its voice, should therefore also be suspect. We provide the text with sense by making sensible and therefore into a text as such. This even implicates Deleuze and Guattari, for when they repeat the Scotusian notion that being speaks in one voice, they risk an eerie echo of the aforementioned phonologism. While notably Deleuze and Guattari do not mean that being is unitary or one in the monistic sense, and instead mean to express, a la their pluralism equals monism, that the one reality that there is multiple and variegated, they do still risk subsuming this multiplicity under a phonologistic reliance on the authenticity of beings' voice. Perhaps a mere matter of semantic slicing, this example still goes to show just how pervasive is the reliance on the authentic voice of phonologism. As Derrida teaches us, we should be wary of anything that claims to speak for itself. I started out seeing the sonic as the defining feature of Finnegans' wake. Its sounds allow it a life beyond meaning and are its height it aspires to. But the more I study Joyce and his commitment to the immortality of a writing that is forever being commented upon, and his creation of, in the wake, a writing that does that to itself, as well as the critical literature at large, the more writing has become the defining, principal, insoluble feature of the wake. Instead of relying on the phonologism of verbal poetry as an attempt to reify the authentic voice of the prophet, uttering the divine word authentically, instead of locating the origin of history in an authentic first word that bears the self-evidence of the truth as presence it expresses about the untainted world, the wake incessantly stages this as a performance that we have phantasmagorically invoked in order to inscribe our own origins, unwittingly co-opting in Arche-Writing. The wake is an attempt to articulate this Arche-Writing as textual artifact. Before the sonic, there is the written. Before one interprets signifiers as sounding a certain way, binding them to a particular phonology, meter, cadence, tone, etc., they are written. The primacy of the written, Arche-Writing, is the condition of reifiability that the wake thrives on. This is strange, for in an important sense, the wake is not noteworthy for its writing, but for its sound. When one tries to grasp, to latch onto the wake, it is by its sound. Relinquishing the impulse to subsume writing under meaning, one lets sound speak forth. In so doing, onomatopoeia, assonance, alliteration, rhythm, and other sonic qualities become markedly apparent. One grows to see the wake as noteworthy for its rather unassuming, if impenetrable, visual appearance, save for the occasional thunder word or the stylized night lessons chapter, being dwarfed by its highly idiosyncratic, noteworthy, and evocative sound. Now, this sonic paradigm is certainly on the right track. It captures the palpability and performativity of language that would grow to define Joyce's later linguistic project. However, it only gets us part of the way in understanding Joyce's rather Kantian point: to ascertain the transcendental conditions of all possible words. This is a twofold task. One must, first, ask an ontological question about the nature of the word, and therefore about meaning, and two, ask a semiotic question about the conditions of any possible word being a word and standing in certain relations to other words. This latter is most concerning for us here, seeing as the former could occupy a whole book. Indeed, Finnegans Wake is such a book. Finnegans Wake is a pre-formal, anti-systematic text. It attempts to articulate beings and concepts in their liminal stages before their formal sedimentation in systems, be they philosophical, linguistic, literary, historical, theological, and so on. As such, both the word and the text, as concepts and beings proper, are in their pre-formal infancy. Malleable, ambiguous, and volatile, one would do a disservice to the Wake to treat either concept as self-evident. The Wake, in an effort to prevent this disservice, stages a number of comic vignettes. Buckley shot the Russian general, the aunt and the grasshopper, Mute and Jude, the prank queen, and so on, that come to act as ironic sites for the slippage of the word. Chance verbal mishaps, missteps, and miscommunications become the exigency of all manner of absurd scenarios, making clear one thing: the word, as traditionally understood, cannot be trusted. Viewed as the stable building block of formal statements of propositional meaning, the philosophical account, as the genuine building blocks of authentic expressions of what we humans really think, want, and feel, the literary account, or as the divine gift ensuring sure knowledge of God and all things eternal, the only things that really matter, the theological account, the word has failed. Words do not hold, but instead slip, laden with ambiguities, gaps, and absurd mutations according to historical shifts as well as idiolectical variation. As such, the word is not an innocent concept. Developing through history and according to a variety of paradigms who negotiate its proper place, the word has been incessantly systematized, and in so doing, restricted, bound, and sanitized. And Joyce finds this intolerable and attempts to confront writing as the crafting of a textuality conscious of its own historicity and iconicity, wary of the very nature of its elements, such as the word. Putting the word into liminal flux, located in a historical continuum of competing narratives, accounts, and perspectives, Joyce bypasses the ontological question about the nature of the word by taking a decidedly anti-essentialist view, that there is no the word, but only already words. Before the authorized word of the Bible, or of national traditions, or of the law, there is a potentiality for word-making. This is what Derrida calls Arche-Writing. It is the transcendental potentiality for the spoken, authorized, systematized words that we create in history. Taken in this light, one should be wary of a sonic co-optation of the Wake, for the same reason Derrida is suspicious of phonologism. Its privileging of the voice as a site of special, metaphysically endowed closeness to an essence of truth, of the logos, of the unmediated presence of the world. This is why Finnegans Wake is so obsessed with beginnings, origins, and history. Invoking these forces us to confront language as a transcendental question of the structures of possibility of the word. We confront the necessity of an inscription potential that precedes any inscription, any action, any decision that we do end up taking. In Finnegans Wake, we have a conglomerate of awkwardly congealed speakers and things spoken, vying for dominance, attention, and authority. In forming such a dense fabric, Joyce brings attention not to the necessity of this or that weaving, but the logic and preconditions of any possible weaving. One steps back and sees at once that writing performs an essential function in human history at large, and that Finnegans Wake is a concerted, philosophical meditation on the conditions of any possible articulation of anything at all. And this is formed as an artifact of Arche-Writing. Viewed in this light, one should consider writing as a principal concern in the Wake as a philosophical problem, in spite of the Wake's often unassuming visual appearance, especially viewed up against more visually experimental texts that both preceded and were contemporary with Joyce, such as Mallarmé's Un conte de déjà made à la Baudelaire. When one reads past the sound, one sees, as Stuart Gilbert has written, that a Baroque superstructure hides the still, and we might say written, frame beneath.